The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tyler, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. As always, I am Tyler, and I'm joined by Greg. Greg, say hello to the people.
Hello, people. Good to see you again.
That's all you get. Today, we are going to be talking about chapters 7 and 8. That is Out of the Woods and A Place of Safety. And before I get started with any of the chapter summary or anything like that, I just need to begin by saying, Greg, thank you so much for not being a musical theater nerd. All of my friends growing up are musical theater nerds, and so it would have in my past been impossible to discuss a chapter called Out of the Woods without an excessive amount of singing.
I see how it is. But I am enough of a musical theater nerd to know it should be Into the Woods, right?
So, you are correct, but okay. Someone would be singing.
They would find the parody. That's not a Weird Al requirement there. You can make that parody easily. Nice.
Excellent. Well, in the chapter Out of the Woods, Rand finally emerges out of the woods and into the town of Emmons Field, and it does not look the way he expected. About half of the city has been destroyed. There are clusters of burnt buildings, but also clusters of buildings that are completely untouched. He's initially greeted by the blacksmith, Master Luhan, who hurries him and Tam along first to Egwene and then to Nynaeve, who realizes she actually can't do anything to heal Tam and decides that her efforts will be best spent elsewhere. So Rand, not knowing quite what to do, goes to the inn, sees the mayor and Tom Marilyn. Initially, they try to get the wisdom again. It doesn't work. But eventually, Tom basically directs the conversation until the mayor realizes that perhaps Moraine, who is revealed to be an Aes Sedai, might be able to help Tam. And so Rand makes his way off, convinces Moraine to help, and the chapter ends with them slowly making their way back towards the inn. So this is a really interesting chapter from my perspective because it's kind of the end of the Rand on his own plot line, and it's when we start to dive into a lot of the other characters who so far have been a little bit more mysterious, starting to get some things kind of detailed about them. So I'm curious what jumped out to you as we start to kind of see the broader picture of who all these characters are.
Yeah, I have two notes here that kind of speak to the general reaction. But the first would be very much what you just said, that here at this moment, we're taking our second pass, right? So we took a first pass where we understood these are interesting, different people, got little hints, little teases of their, greater importance or at least difference from how they were presenting. And then this time it's like, okay, now let's give you the real deal. Or, I'm not naive enough to think we have the full picture on them all, but we get a more complete picture, particularly of Moraine. What was interesting to me is that then you rethink what happened last time with the pledging of them and all that. And that doesn't come up again, but it's like, well, this must have a really different significance than it seemed to back when that happened. And my second note here, and this is more about the crafting of the chapter, I just want to say, I think I personally really respond when writers just give us the aftermath of a battle and not the blow by blow. Here's what happened. Here's how they advanced down this street and hit this building and that building. My wife has long ago stopped watching Marvel movies with me. But one of the things she always said is she just gets bored because you just watch them punch each other for a while, and the outcome is never actually in doubt. You're just waiting for the moment when Captain America wins, or fill in your Marvel superhero. And I think I get that way sometimes in big battles in books, and it's like, oh, I could have these descriptions or could do that, but I'd rather just know, like, okay, here's the outcome. Here's what happened in these houses. And to me, that is also Lion Witch in the Wardrobe does that, right? Yeah. It just completely skips the battle, and then they adapt it into a movie, and they're like, no, 3 hours of battle. Who are you kidding? And we'll do that later. I guess The Hobbit is guilty of that too. So yeah, so those are my two kind of themes. Like, yes, let's peel back more layers, let's dive in. And second, like, yeah, let's not worry about the action, but just talk about the outcomes and the effects it has on our characters. Where was your head at as you came through or out of the woods?
Well, a couple things. First off, in response to your discussion about kind of do we see the battle or do we just see the aftermath of the battle, two things jump to mind as you say that. One is that I think this is a gift of Jordan's. He knows where the character moments are in the midst of plot, and that's what he really cares about. But the other thing that jumps to mind is you said, like the Lord of the Rings adapted this way, Narnia adapted this way. It actually turns out, we'll see when you finally watch the television show, probably in a few months, the same thing kind of happens in the Wheel of Time. We see a very different perspective on that battle, and I think it's exactly what you're describing. On screen, punching is at least a little bit exciting. On the page, punching is not exciting at all. I think, to me, the thing that really stands out about this chapter is how much of it we see kind of Rand kind of spiral downward throughout the chapter, right? He gets a little bit more desperate and a little bit more kind of willing to take risks. And by the end of the chapter, he's willing to just say, like, I will do anything an Aes Sedai wants of me. And I thought that kind of like slow progression of how much he was willing to kind of concede and give as his options dwindled and diminished, I thought that was pretty well drawn, even in the midst of, I think you're right, we kind of missed the action of this chapter, although it's an effective strategy.
Yeah. And, I think last episode we were talking about how it's nice that he's not just like having a coming of age moment, that he's a little more worldly or a little more mature. But that downward spiral you just described is very childlike, right? And it's natural. I mean, we all have, well, I won't generalize. A lot of people have attachment to their parents. And so when there's just, clearly Tam is all he has in this world. And when there's this such grave threat to it, and the news just gets worse and worse and worse, I think you're right that he's getting more desperate, more childlike, just ready to do anything. And I was interested in how present the revelation from the last chapter was here, right? Yeah. That he's constantly like, my father, and then he's always got that like, but is he like well, I've called him my father. And just to have those two emotions kind of always in tension puts the character at a really interesting spot. And again, I would credit Jordan with describing that in a way that I could, having no experience of that, I could really understand still, right? And I could understand that you would have that gnawing at you until you could ask the questions. And so part of that desperation is to then get those answers, but it's also just sheer love for his father. In terms of the desperation, let me say one of my favorite quotes here was, "If the light won't help, we'll help ourselves," which I think was a townsperson, not Rand.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and I just liked that attitude again, that this region of Two Rivers is used to being outside the action, and they're used to being self-sufficient, and so they this isn't some like devout religious sect or something. Right. They're like, yeah, if luck's on our side, fantastic. If not, we'll make our own luck. And I liked that attitude kind of coming around throughout a lot of the characters.
Yeah, and I like that we get to see in this chapter some of that like Two Rivers stubbornness bump up against Two Rivers stubbornness, right? We see a couple of times where like Egwene and Rand are, kind of in tension, or Nynaeve and Rand, especially. That's the moment I think where things boil over more than anything else, is when Nynaeve is just like, I cannot help your father, and Rand's unwilling to accept it. And I think that is something really interesting, right? So far, we've heard tales of, the Two Rivers men never giving in, but I think in this chapter we get to see a few places where it's stubbornness butting up against stubbornness, and that's I think a little more interesting than just the independent, these people are gonna stand up to whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it certainly, because I've become attached to Rand, when Nynaeve is just like, nope, can't do anything, I immediately, bumped against that. And I was like, oh, she doesn't seem like she really cares or is really trying. It seems like, I will say, I interpret it as she's not lying. She just knows a helpless case. And I would say helpless, not as in no one can heal him, which proves to be the case by the end of the chapter, but more like it's beyond my powers, right?
Yeah.
And recognizing the limitations that she has. Gosh, I think it's Pearl Harbor, the bad World War II movie, where they have the young naive nurse who's just realizing the world go mark with lipstick who can get treatment and who they shouldn't bother wasting material on. Which, again, I'm not here to promote Michael Bay, but it is a powerful idea that you hand a probably 18-year-old girl, I think it's lipstick, and to just say, like, if we can save them, put a mark. If we can't, and that's the mode I think Nynaeve is in, and she's also a young woman. I mean, one with a lot of power, Egwene is with her as well, and trying to negotiate through the village. I think, again, the motivation there seems to be, let me do the most good I can, and there's just no reason to waste my limited resources on Tam, as much as that hurts.
Yeah, I really read this in the same way that I've seen in like a lot of war movies where, someone gets shot and they're like, we can't leave the guy behind. And they're like, no, we got to leave him behind. Like, that's how I read that scene with Nynaeve is, I can either try to save Tam and let 5 people die, or I can, save all 5 of those people, and now we're back to the good place, obviously. But no, I think that makes sense, and I think this is a really good example of Robert Jordan showing you what the characters see, where the description of Nynaeve in this chapter is very much of her being like brusque and dismissive and not explaining fully, and I think that's because that's what Rand is picking up on in this moment, right? It's not necessarily because Nynaeve isn't being, compassionate or what have you. It's that we're seeing the character from the perspective of, basically a panicked 17-year-old.
Yeah. And exactly what you're saying, but to limit it to the one character's perspective, I think does, again, help me feel more and more attached to Rand, which is just natural when it's from his perspective. But it's also just a nice, easy way to continue to learn about all of this slowly, right? To not limit it in. And, the next piece of that, or another piece of this that jumped out to me, is that he's immediately clear that the inn is untouched, right? Like he's approaching the inn, and then he sees I believe it's the dragon fang mark.
The fang of the dragon.
The fang of the dragon on the door. Knows immediately this is a mark of evil. And because we're limited to his perspective, he just moves on, and because he's worried about his father and all that. And I was like, well, let's unpack this. Like, hold on. And yet again, that's going to be what keeps me reading, because it's like, I have to know more about this. So I guess I'll throw it to you with the question of where I ended up on this Fang of the Dragon. So it's known as an evil mark, and it's kind of dismissed by a lot of the town as, oh, there's just some kind of hooligans out putting this mark up. Reminded me, not to make light of it, but when, a 3rd grader scratches a swastika into a bookshelf, they don't actually know the hate they're invoking. They're just like, this is a funny forbidden symbol I'm going to put here. And so it felt like that's how it was immediately dismissed. But then I immediately would do, well, is this why the inn is untouched, right? Is this a part of this? Could this be, that then you're getting into, the Bible and Moses, right? Like,
Right.
let's mark the doors of the houses that we're not going to touch. And it made me suspicious of the innkeeper at that moment. And then his behavior throughout the other, I guess he doesn't come in till the next chapter again, but it just, I don't know, something's going on there. And so that's where I landed on all of that. I know you don't want to spoil anything or share too much, but how would you react to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got the read correct on kind of how people are taking this, although I think possibly for a slightly different reason, right? I think your metaphor of like the swastika as opposed to the dragon's fang is pretty much right? In the same way that like someone declares they are a Nazi with a swastika, it feels like the dragon's fang in some way is like shorthand for evil somehow in this world. I think it's actually in the next chapter that we get Tom mentioning like people drawing the dragon's fang, and maybe it was because Moraine and the Aes Sedai were here, or maybe it was because like he couldn't figure out exactly what was going on, but we get a little bit of speculation. But to me, I think the reason for kind of it being written off or dismissed is less because they don't see it as important, although I think that is part of it, right? They see these problems as being so far off, whatever. I think part of it too is just like it's kind of like worrying about someone drawing a swastika in the stairwell when there are Nazis invading, right? Like the Trollocs are already here. And so I think part of it is the mayor just being like, look, I don't have time to deal with something like this. It's life or death at this point. So I think it's a little of both of those to some degree. The other thing I wanted to say about the Dragon Fang is I obviously don't want to spoil anything thematically or anything like that, but if you're just curious visually what the Dragon's Fang looks like, it actually works out quite nicely. The next chapter that we will be reading, chapter 9, the icon at the beginning of that chapter is actually an image of the Dragon's Fang. So if you're curious just what it looks like, we've at least got that visual marker that we can go to at the next page after the one that we finished for this episode.
Well, I don't think we've disclosed previously that you're my dungeon master, and you are. So it's very jarring to have a visual necessary that you don't immediately make pop up for me in Roll20 as we're playing or something. But I did just flip over to that, and that's helpful and nice. I think it also is just a reminder to me I should be paying more attention to those symbols and what's going on with them, and whatever patterns may emerge from that. Yes. I guess my one other question about the Fang of the Dragon is everybody is sure it's people who did it, and it's not Trollocs. Is that because Trollocs are incapable of it, or did it predate the group arriving at the town? Or am I just, it doesn't really matter?
I think those are totally reasonable questions. I think those are the kind of things that we want to be thinking through. My only change on what you've said is I would probably not suspect Trollocs, because the smartest one we've met, the most difficult sentence it said was Murdrill want talk. So okay. Like, I feel like their artistic skills maybe aren't quite there, but could it have been the Murdrill? Spot on 100%. Like that I think is something to worry about.
Come on, Tyler. I've seen those elephants that paint, and they can manage better than I can in a lot of cases. But all right, point taken. So we should be suspecting, humans or the Fade, just in our hierarchy classification of creatures. Okay, so maybe my one exception to I like seeing the aftermath and not the battle, and again to the limited perspective from Rand, is we get told that Moraine called lightning down into the village, and that is weakened her, and she does not have a limitless amount of power, that is already weakened her, and she's got to spend some more of that limited energy to heal Tam, and that Lan used his sword in ways that impressed, right? That was fast and dancing through the crowd. So I think that was one thing. I mean, again, I was like, well, a director would definitely show that. I mean, that's made for movies or television or somewhere in between on Amazon Prime. And so that to me was really interesting, that it's curious that that seems to be their credentials, right? It's not like they say we're Aes Sedai. They just did stuff
Yep.
and everybody was like, well, they're not from around here. um and yet it's interesting that Rand accepts all of that, having not seen any of it. I mean, he trusts the villagers, and I think to your earlier point, he's just desperate, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, okay, it might be a solution there. And then I guess what Moraine does that before healing that helps us understand this is she shows a lot of expertise. And
Yeah.
so the two pieces I'll pick up on from what she said is there were 7 bands of Trollocs present in the village.
Yep.
So she had the foreknowledge of how to identify which band they belonged to. And then the tied to that thought, with the idea that the 7 bands are united, somebody has united the Trollocs. Then she says, "We are behind," and it's kind of a gripping, chilling thought, right? Again, we know this is going to be the battle from between darkness and light, and immediately the "we" to me is the light, and not just simply her and Lan or just the Aes Sedai. So I liked that moment a lot. I both for the tease and for the like, oh shoot, we're behind.
Yeah. I actually just, in kind of that same vein, when Moraine first sees Rand, the immediate words that come out of her mouth are "a little more light in the darkness." And that, I think, is the moment where I like believe Moraine, right? Up until this point, I'm kind of like 50-50. Are they lying? What's going on? But that is her, she brightens up and immediately responds that way to seeing Rand. That, I think, is the moment where I buy her. I don't think she's as evil as I had worried about, in the first, 5-6 chapters. Actually, I had one thing I wanted to talk about prior to getting to Moraine, if you don't mind.
It. Yeah, please do.
Just because I think it's easy to miss on the first time reading through. I really loved the conversation between Rand and the mayor and Tom when Rand arrives initially to the inn and is kind of figuring out like, what can we do? Because you see Tom repeatedly ask questions of the mayor, and the mayor gets mad at him. And then like 5 or 6 questions later, he's like, "Oh, you've been leading me towards remembering Moraine as Aes Sedai this whole time. Why didn't you just come out and say it?" And I thought that little, like, Tom is clearly trying to do the right thing in this scene, but he also doesn't want to be seen to be doing the right thing, right? He needs the mayor to say it instead of him saying it. Is an interesting dynamic we see in that scene that I think is easy to miss.
Yeah, I would say I didn't. I think to me, Tom was the least exciting part of this chapter, so I probably kind of skipped over that mentally. Okay, interesting. And knowing earlier he was very cautious around her, makes me think I certainly wouldn't think he's of the dark, but that he in his role might be more the chaotic neutral or something that dabbles, the kind of rogue, right, who dabbles in between the light and the dark. And so like you're saying, wants to keep his position there, not as somebody keeping up the light or so on. Interesting. Good to point out. Interesting.
I think that's all I had for this chapter. Was there any other kind of like last thoughts or big things that you wanted to make sure we chatted about?
I have 2 other thoughts listed here. Lan is grumpy/rude. I think that is more. I am understanding he's kind of the caregiver for Moraine, so it's not anger at Rand. It's just he has a job, right? His job is to protect her and to serve her. But more importantly, I thought it was really interesting that immediately, but don't trust my notes, Moraine is very concerned about Rand's dreams. And that was interesting to me because, again, I think we get a clue at this in the next chapter, certainly. But we know that the Dark Rider only targeted boys of a certain age, and that had a kind of psychological effect. And that just made me start to wonder, okay, so are dreams a portal somewhere else. Again, without my wife, but I recently saw Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, which I know you haven't seen,
I still
but
haven't.
they have this kind of absurd thing that is really not a spoiler. That is, all dreams you've ever had at any time are you experiencing yourself in another dimension. Every single one ever. Not very logical. So it just made me, I kind of jumped to there and thought like, well, oh, okay. So our dreams something, some kind of clairvoyance to another self, another location, or something like that. And that tied with this mysterious parentage. Does he have, is it like Princess Leia remembering her mom or something like that, right? Where he might have dreams that reveal that. So good chapter overall. Pleased with, again, more plot, more kind of keeping things moving. And I think, I at least think as you summarize chapter 8, it's giving us a clear hint that of what the structure of the next chunk of this book is going to be. And that felt good at this point. So how about your summary of chapter 8, A Place of Safety?
Yes. So in the chapter, A Place of Safety, Rand and Moraine and Lan arrive at the inn. Initially, Moraine basically sits down and starts healing, and then Rand has a bit of a conversation with Lan. We get a little bit of information about Tam's sword. We get a little bit of information about Lan and his relationship with Moraine. And then Moraine kind of steps back for a second and explains this new item that's being introduced to us, something called an Angriel. She uses it to heal Tam. And then while she's doing so, we do get a lot more detail about Murdrail or halflings or all of the billion different names that they have. And then we finally kind of learn what is exactly going on in the last few chapters. We learn that only a select group of buildings were really targeted by the Trollocs, and they specifically focused on 3 individuals. So that's Rand, Matt, and Perrin. And then we also learn that Moraine has a plan for how to make sure that everyone in the 2 rivers and those 3 individuals are safe. And it is to get them to the titular place of safety, which is the city of Tar-Valon. And Rand thinks how absurdly far away that is and how impossible it seems to get there. But that seems to be kind of the plan going forward. And as you say, that's our roadmap. So other than just kind of knowing where we're going, what were your thoughts on this chapter generally?
Yeah, I mean, and I know this is used pejoratively, and I don't intend it to be. It was a big exposition dump, right? It was like, okay, now let's fill in these pieces and not solve the problems, but fill in enough detail that you feel satisfied or you feel like there's momentum building. And I think I enjoyed it for all those reasons, and have been enjoying getting these things. So, I mean, gosh, where to jump in? I think it's probably smarter to take it chronologically.
Okay.
So some of the early pieces that seem to be dropping hints, Lan suspects the Gleeman, right? Because he implies that he was absent during the raid, which, coupling that with what we just talked about, seems to be, oh, okay, is he playing both sides? Is he trying to make himself neutral?
Right.
Was he also just a coward and was hiding, or was he perhaps, the one drawing the dragon fangs or things like that? So yeah, that's my first thing to bump on there.
Yeah, and I think the interesting counter argument that we get, I think it's from the mayor, is he doesn't say like, I saw him battling Trollocs or I saw him, helping people. His response is basically, well, I don't know how he would have singed his cape if nothing else happened. So we know that he was somehow involved with the fires or something, but we don't actually have eyewitnesses of him in the same way that we do Lan and Moraine, or even the other character who is missing in these chapters is Padden Fane, who the only information we get about him is he vanished early on and his cart was destroyed. So, I think we've got some like gaps in the story, even as the mayor does have like something mildly exculpating for Tom.
Yeah, and so Moraine discusses basically the power that it would take to ward off an attack of this. And so these are bit quotes, but refers to the one power, which is where she draws strength, and refers to how she would need my sisters, she says, right?
Yes.
So both of those help fill in a bit more about the mythology of that group, the Aes Sedai.
Aes Sedai, just to be
Aes
clear.
Sedai.
Aes Sedai, yeah.
Every time I keep
It's
forgetting Aes
impossible. I
Sedai.
completely get it.
The Aes Sedai. And so with that further detail, that connected me back to, okay, they're all women, so
Yep.
very much like the wisdom is the power in the village. This is the, for lack of a better term, national version of that, right? The FBI to your local police or
Yep.
something like that. And so those hints are intriguing. Again, okay, we know there's a power, we know there's magic, lightning, but limited, right? Not all
Yep.
powerful, has to recharge, has only so much they can do. I mean, that sounds like a video game to me.
It does.
I always love in a Star Wars video game where they give you like a force counter, because you're like, that's not really how Star Wars ever presents the force. I guess maybe Baby Yoda is the exception to that. But then it's like, well, you have to limit that in some way. There's a version of that going on here.
And actually, if you don't mind, I actually just really like the way that's described by Lan. I think it might be at the end of the last chapter as opposed to in this one, but regardless, he describes it as being the amount that she has done calling the lightning and healing people and all of that. He describes it as being the same as if she had run laps around the village. So I like the idea that it's almost just like physically exhausting to use the magic. It's not that it's somehow some other, weakness or something else that's being drained from you. It's just in exactly the same way running a marathon is tiring, doing magic is tiring.
Also implying that you could train, right? I mean, if I want to run a marathon, I'm dead in a gutter right now, 3 blocks from my house, somehow with a Big Mac in my hand. But you could train and be stronger. And again, now that we know there's a place of safety, Tor Valon, that sounds to me like actually I'm thinking of Patrick Rothfuss, right? Like an academy town, like a place where I think I started our first episode, I'm like, I don't read fantasy, Tyler, this is all new. And then every time I have a good comp, because I forget how much fantasy I have read, even though I don't think of myself as a fantasy reader. So we're all learning about ourselves on this journey, and what's in my read stacks, gosh. And now I'm just distracted thinking about how much I want the third Patrick Rothfuss book, which will never come. It feels like one of those.
I have to say, being a Wheel of Time fan from way back when does make me a lot more prepared for like the Rothfusses and the Martins of the world, because I've already gone through that tragedy once.
One of my good friends, Jen, I think was at Comic-Con and ended up in an elevator with Patrick Rothfuss, and it took all her staying power to not be like, go home and write. What are you doing at Comic-Con?
He was on an episode of Critical Role like 3-4 years ago, and they spent the entire intro just like yelling at him for not writing, and I loved it.
Yeah, I love both those books. So it's spoken out of love, but certainly there. So I'm imagining Tor Valon to be something like that. I think Tarvalon. We're jumping to the very end of the chapter, but noting that it's a bastion of the light. It was unconquered in the last war, which would also mean a future war, because I understand how Wheel of Time works.
That is correct.
So that to me, it sounds almost like Gondor or one of these beautiful cities, but I am imagining a city of learning and light and enlightenment, we'll say.
And while we're actually thinking about, the wheel is a circle, this is something that, happened a long time ago and at some point in the future, I also do just think one really interesting thing that Robert Jordan does with naming his cities in his world is he does include in them references to some of the things that we would think of as like legends or myths or even things in our own world. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Tar Valon is very, very close to the Arthurian city of Avalon. Like, I think that's the immediate link that we're supposed to just linguistically be making. And it kind of fits with the way that you've been describing the city, right? The shining white walls, undefeated, kind of the center of culture in an area. It feels like about the right metaphor.
Yeah. And I guess just the V sound also makes me think of Valhalla, right? And Gosh, I think there is a Lord of the Rings elves thing. I was doing some
That sounds
subtle
right. Yeah.
Googling that I could not do fast enough. But I think when they are leaving Middle Earth, they're
Mm.
going somewhere with a V as well. I can't Google fast enough. So we'll let listeners write in and tell me what it is. Uh, okay. So again, understanding this world not as a new fantasy world we have to understand, but a world related to our own that we have to uncover in some way. Uh, Gosh, and again, jumping all over. Anything else on the Aes Sedai?
Um, I don't think I had anything that immediately jumped out, but I did just have a couple of quotes that I pulled kind of related to things you said that I really liked. At
Yeah.
one point, you said, we heard kind of repeated mention of the one power. At one point, Rand refers to it as the one power drawn from the true source that drove the wheel of time. And I like that description of thinking about it's like a power that is actually spinning this like hypothetical wheel of time in a circle. I think that's kind of just a cool metaphor. The other thing that jumped out at me is just when she is describing Tar Valon, she talks about how the dark fears to attack the shining walls. And then she also says, oh no, this was actually something that Tom said, kind of related to it, but he talks about how Tar Valon might be a place of safety from the same people who would have drawn the dragon's fang on the door. And I thought that connection of like kind of this big evil to something that she thinks, I think like Rand and the mayor can probably relate to a little more, I thought was just an interesting way of framing that compared to, kind of the big, lofty way that we see a lot of things described otherwise.
Yes. And again, to think that it went unconquered, but it's not like they ignored it. Like they were there, they were ready, and there was presumably some kind of siege or stalemate that eventually occurred against the Shining Walls, is of interest to me.
Yeah, I actually, if you don't mind, then moving both back and forward chronologically, because
Wheel of Time style. There it is. Yeah.
In this chapter, we get some really interesting descriptions of a couple of different objects, some of which we've seen before and some of which we haven't seen at all. And so I thought it was really interesting that we kind of we get some details about Rand and presumably Tam's Heron Mark sword. We get a little bit of detail, I think, about Moraine's staff, which I will say for people who have read the series vanishes in like a chapter or two.
Oh, no.
Forever. I think Jordan just forgot about it. And then we also get this description of the Angreal that Moraine is using in order to heal Tam. And so I think we get this really interesting, we've gotten a lot of world building, like big picture world building. And now I think we're getting really like micro level world building. So I'm curious if there was anything in those objects or those descriptions that jumped out to you, or if one of those things kind of like, was there one of those that you latched onto as being more important or more interesting? Did you have any theories about those objects?
I definitely, and we were joking before we recorded that we were supposed to record like 3 nights ago. So we're both a little delayed from the book. So the one that when you mentioned objects, I'm like, oh, right, we got to talk about the sword. So the sword stood out the most in my memory. We had the description before, and we understood that it was very odd that Tam had this. Surprising, it may be more than odd. And then, as I recall, Land could guess what was on it before it was revealed, right? Yep. He could determine what it is. So I guess my mind went to that this has to be one of two things. It has to be a very rare weapon that is like of legend and well known, or just about the diametrical opposite, which is it has to be so common that, it's the sword of the musketeers. That doesn't make sense because they would have guns, but no, they have sword anyway.
They also have
but that it's like, oh, well, then he knows immediately that Tam belonged to some group that always used Heron swords. And so to me, it has to be one or the other. It can't be in the middle.
Well, and we don't get like a complete description of this, but we do get something partial. Lan says in some places in the world, a heron marked blade is a sign of a master swordsman. So we don't know where, we don't know when, we don't know how, but we at least get that little hint that this probably has something to do with a master swordsman, but whether that means Tam is one or met one or what is still very unclear.
The swordsman of Bravos, right? And
Yeah.
in Game of Thrones, that's what comes to mind there as the comp. And that it is about its construction, right? So it's a special blade. It's something that was forged in a particular place by a particular craftsman. I mean, that resonates with so much mythology that seems and I'm gonna guess then that means it's more like a relic, more unique than common, that there are a limited number of blades from that location, and that is a part of it. So there's where I'm putting my money down. Listeners, tune in 3 weeks when we see how wrong I was.
3 years. The other object that we get kind of a really detailed description of in this chapter is Moraine, it is described as a woman with long flowing hair and a long dress. It's like a hand-sized, I think it's ivory, but browned with age. And it's described as allowing Aes Sedai. Rand refers to it as like all of the great acts of the Aes Sedai have been performed with Angreal. And Moraine says she was able, I think she even uses the word channel. She says she was able to channel more than she would otherwise have been able to when using this object. And I think she, even in this point, she briefly describes what this object is, and she talks about how the ability to make and even to some degree understand Angreal has been lost to time. And I thought that was just a really interesting thing for a world that is so cyclical and that is about us seeing connections with our own world. To think about how much has been lost as well as how much we're learning is an interesting place to be on chapter 7 or 8 of a book. I was curious whether you noticed that much, or whether it was something that kind of just, there was so much going on in the chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a little of there's so much going on, but I remember having trouble picturing that, right? Because and even just listening to your description right now, it's not a typical fantasy thing in my mind anyway. Again, with my limited experience, it's not a magic sword, it's not a wizard's staff, it's not a necklace with a special crystal or anything like that. You're talking about a small statue, and again, those verbs of focusing or channeling energy through it, or I guess through it either way, but more not going from Moraine to the thing, but rather from the thing to Moraine to pull in. Again, makes me more interested in what this one power is and how that could be channeled. And then the other fantasy comp I would bring is N.K. Jemisin's
You have read so much fantasy.
I know. Her trilogy that won the Hugo, each book won the Hugo, and I'm forgetting what the name, the
Broken Earth.
Broken Earth. That's what I went with first. In those books, there are these giant crystals in the sky, and I don't believe this is a spoiler, but some of the power in that universe is that you could channel energy through those crystals to affect people and the earth and so on. So that, again, and I also want to just emphasize for listeners, I understand that in most of these cases I'm being like, oh, Robert Jordan's just like these things that came much later than him, and I understand the way that the influence would flow in these cases. But
if you believe the Wheel of Time, this actually came before That's and right. after.
And so it's both. So listeners can't be mad at me as a part of that. Again, but in both cases, it's clearly him saying, check, keep an eye on these, more to come later, which is a beautiful thing to be doing, like you said, in chapter 8 of your first novel in a long series.
Yeah, absolutely. I had one last thing that I wanted to make sure we talked about in this chapter, which is the fact that we finally now know who are our main protagonists of the people in the two rivers, right? We have gone from meeting like 32 rivers people. It could be Tam, it could be the mayor, it could be whoever. We are now pretty heavily centered in on three boys who are all approximately the same age, right? We've got Rand, who we obviously knew was going to be a key piece, but we've also got Matt and Perrin joining the gang. So that revelation that it's not just Rand, it could potentially be any of the three of them, and that they're being specifically targeted. I'm curious how that kind of changed your thinking about what we've seen in the previous 7 chapters at this point. This is kind of our first rug out from under you moment.
Yeah. And I think, like you're saying, that this was a specifically targeted attack and that the Fade wanted to speak to Rand. And again, I think I'd left the previous chapters being like, it's just Rand. And so to now have it's the three of them is a good surprise. And again, just because I'm comparing to everything tonight, this sounded like Harry Potter to me, right? We get the revelation, gosh, I think it's in book 7 of Harry Potter, that Voldemort chose Harry, that it could have been Harry or Neville. And, he went for the mudblood, as it were. It was in book 5.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's
you're
in
right.
Phoenix, where there's like the prophecy in the
glass ball, and in there. Yes, you're absolutely right. So there, that felt very similar, right? Yeah. And so in this case, it doesn't seem like the Dark Ones have chosen one. They're rounding up anybody who could fit the description. Now we have the added information of knowing that Rand's parentage is in dispute or is unknown. Yeah. So I think it's clear, it's, at least to me, it's probably still him that it has greater significance. But the fact that the three of them are going to take off, that just sounds more fun than just having Rand in the woods worried about every little thing. But to send a company on an adventure sounds like more fun and what I'm into. And interesting that it came down to they were born within weeks of each other.
Yeah.
So okay. So, the Dark One knows that one of these three is stolen from elsewhere, or has some special abilities. Is there a prophecy? Is there something? That all works. It just seems to me like when you're looking at the three and one is like totally different than everybody else in town, your answer would kind of appear pretty quickly.
Well, and I will say, again, no show spoilers, but just to mention something that show viewers will be noticing at this point. In the show, one major change that they made was removing the possibility of gender mattering at all. In the show, there are 4 rather than 3, and Egwene is added into that mix. So this is actually a decided difference from what we get on the television show, where here it's just the boys who are being considered, whereas in the show, women can potentially be included as well.
Nice. And that's all I had. I mean, I think we're treating the like long description of the Fade kind of lightly, but it seemed pretty straightforward. They're the Uruk-hai of this taxonomy, right? They're mixed with humans and Trollocs, and they certainly have the luck of the Dark One.
I think the only really interesting thing to me in that section is just we do get the little bit of detail that they refer to Murdrail as being kind of the leftovers from when Dreadlords created Trollocs. And so we learn that Trollocs are not natural, they are made in some way, and Murdrail are almost like the byproducts of that creation. But other than that, I think you're right. I think it's really great world building, but nothing that we need to like super dive into in a ton of detail.
Yeah, and I guess maybe the one other thing that stood out to me is that they're not as big and powerful as the myth implies, right? Yeah. Their reputation is worse than they actually are. Okay, so closing out chapters 7 and 8, again, a good time onward. And it felt like a pivot moment. I think, it seems like we're going to get just a little bit more here in the village, maybe one conversation between Tam and Rand, or a really nice dear dad letter, and then we'll be off on our quest. So here's where we're left, dear listeners. And I will say, I was recently talking to a friend who started Wheel of Time to listen along with us, and I'm sure he's listening to this right now. Hi, Ben. He told me, I asked how he was enjoying the audiobook, and he said, and this was never explained, a text message simply read, "Wheel of Time is my spirituality." I'm like, oh,
Okay.
all right. So you're having an effect even before we're on air. So I hope we haven't spoiled your spirituality. So listeners, we are going to be in a little bit of a different situation for our next episode. So, Tyler nicely broke down all the different chunks of the book. And what happens every once in a while is that 2 chapters is just a little too short and 3 chapters is just a little too long. And so we have to make the call on, do we lump the 3 together and potentially go a little longer, or do we keep the kind of shorter runtime in order to keep it tight? So at this particular juncture, we don't have your input because we have not aired these episodes yet. So we have made the call that we're going to air on the long side. So for next episode, you should read chapters 9, 10, and 11. That is Tellings of the Wheel, Leave Taking, and The Road to Terran Ferry. And then what we will do when we drop this current episode that you just listened to, if you could pop onto our social media and find where we asked this question, we're going to set up a poll to ask, do you want us to stick to 2 chapters when this happens, or do you mind the occasional 3-chapter one? And I think the only thing I'll say in regards to that is we're constantly aiming for about 30 pages, because that seems about the right amount to read in busy lives and busy commutes and what have you. Obviously, if you're following along using the audiobook, it's a little different, but we aim for about 30 pages. So that's why we're asking. This particular chunk that we've decided to go a little long on is 38. So we know that's pushing the limits, but we hope you read all 3 and you come back to us next time. Tyler, anything else to add?
No, I just want to say the only thing I'll mention, along with, like, obviously we want your input both on, length of chapters and anything else that you think we could be doing better or we could be improving on. But as I say that, I do want to mention that we are a little bit time travelers. Greg has mentioned this. We are currently recording episode 5 before we have even released episode 1. So it is going to take us a little bit of time. This probably ends up getting posted 3-4 weeks from now, and then it'll be another 4 or 5 weeks of us having recorded episodes before we can really respond to what you're saying. So we're obviously going to be listening. We're really excited to get the fan community going, but just be aware, this is definitely going to be one of those like really big ships that takes some time to turn, just because of the nature of when we're recording versus when you're answering questions. But other than that, let me just say, not only are we continuing to kind of advance the plot, but we are very rapidly closing in on what I see as kind of the moment where the switch flips a little bit in this series, and we really get to some of the stuff that excites me and got me to really kind of buy into this series the first time that I read it. So please stick around with us. Like we said, we're going to be doing 3 chapters next week. That's 9, 10, and 11. And we hope that you'll come back and join us as we get an opportunity to see people finally leave the 2 rivers and as we journey through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tyler Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.